I've been on the bench for a long time, and over the years, I've seen just about every kind of person walk into my courtroom. People who are nervous, embarrassed, apologetic, even angry. But every so often, someone walks in with a look that tells you everything you need to know before a single word is spoken. That was the case with Marcus Thompson. It was a Thursday morning, around 11:20 a.m. The courtroom was moving along as usual. Quiet hum, papers shuffling, a few routine cases before mine. When the bailiff called Marcus's name, I looked up and immediately his body language spoke louder than anything he could have said. He walked in wearing jeans, a gray hoodie and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His hands were buried deep in his pockets, and he moved with that heavy, reluctant pace of someone who didn't want to be there. I asked him, as I ask everyone, to please remove his hat in the courtroom. He did, but slowly, deliberately, as if to say, "This is a waste of my time." That moment told me something right away. Respect is the first thing I notice in my courtroom. Not for me personally, but for the process. When someone walks in already dismissive, it's usually because they've decided that nothing I say will matter. Marcus was cited for reckless driving, 87 miles per hour in a 55 zone on Route 95. That's not a small infraction. That's 32 miles over the speed limit, and at that speed, lives can be changed in seconds. Now, normally, when someone appears for a charge like that, they're nervous. They know it's serious. They'll explain, they'll apologize, they'll try to show that it was a mistake, not a pattern. But Marcus wasn't like that. Before I could even begin to review his case, he said something that made everyone in the courtroom stop. I asked him to repeat himself, and he did. Louder this time, more defiant. I said, "I'm not paying anything. I pay taxes already." "That's enough." I paused for a moment and just looked at him. I wanted to make sure he realized what he was saying, that he was refusing to pay a fine that hadn't even been decided yet. Now, I've heard excuses before, thousands of them, but rarely do I hear someone announce their refusal before I've even spoken a word about the outcome. It wasn't frustration talking, it was arrogance. The kind that comes from believing the rules apply to everyone else but you. I could feel the air in the courtroom change. The clerk stopped typing. The prosecutor looked up from her notes. Even the bailiff shifted his stance slightly, just in case the situation escalated. I asked him calmly, "Mr. Thompson, I haven't issued a fine yet. Why are you already saying you won't pay?" He folded his arms and said, "Because I know how this works." "You're just going to fine me a few $100s. Well, I'm telling you now, I'm not paying it." There was no anger in his voice, just complete certainty, as if this was some negotiation he could control. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about punishment. I was thinking about how a person gets to this point where defiance feels easier than accountability. People like Marcus often come into court, not just with unpaid tickets, but with years of resentment toward authority, the system, maybe even their own lives. And sometimes that resentment blinds them to reality. I've learned that when someone walks in already convinced the world is against them, they're not really arguing with the judge. They're arguing with themselves. Still, it's my job to stay calm, no matter what comes across that bench. So I looked at him, steady and patient, and said, "All right, Mr. Thompson, let's start from the beginning." But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be a typical case, because Marcus Thompson hadn't just walked into a courtroom that day. He'd walked in carrying every bad decision he'd made, every excuse he'd rehearsed, and a mindset that was about to cost him far more than a traffic fine. After Marcus Thompson made it clear that he wasn't planning to pay anything, I decided to take a step back. When a defendant walks in defensive, sometimes the worst thing a judge can do is match that energy. My job isn't to argue, it's to understand. So I spoke softly and said, "All right, Mr. Thompson, let's start from the beginning. Tell me what happened on Route 95. He didn't even pause to think. He just shrugged and said, "I was driving. I was going with traffic. That's what happened." That tone told me everything. He wasn't defensive or nervous. He was dismissive. And that's worse, because when someone's defensive, it usually means they care. Dismissiveness, on the other hand, means they've already decided this whole process doesn't matter. I looked down at the officer's report. According to the documentation, Marcus had been weaving between lanes, tailgating other vehicles and driving 87 miles per hour in a 55 zone. That's not a simple mistake. That's the kind of behavior that can end lives. I asked him, Mr. Thompson, the officer reported that you were weaving through traffic and following cars too closely. Is that accurate? He gave me another shrug. I was trying to get somewhere. Everyone drives like that on 95. That's a line I've heard before. It's a dangerous sentence because it's a way of pushing responsibility away. So I leaned forward slightly and said, Mr. Thompson, not everyone drives 32 miles over the speed limit while weaving between cars. He stared at me, arms crossed, and replied, Look, Your Honor, I don't know what you want me to say. I was speeding, fine, whatever, but I'm not paying some ridiculous fine just because the state needs money. That word, how ridiculous, hung in the air. You could hear the tension in the room. I've always tried to maintain an environment of respect in my courtroom. I listen, I give people a chance to explain, and I make sure they're treated with dignity. But that respect has to go both ways. So I asked him again carefully, Mr. Thompson, I haven't issued any fine yet. Why are you already saying you won't pay? He smirked, leaned back, and said, Because I know how this works. You're going to hit me with some $300 fine. Tell me to pay it in 30 days, and then go on to the next guy. I'm telling you right now, I'm not paying it. I pay enough in taxes already. The city makes enough money off me. Now, I've been a judge long enough to recognize when someone isn't just angry. They're disillusioned. What I saw in Marcus wasn't hatred of the law itself. It was resentment toward life, and resentment has a way of blinding a person to their own role in their circumstances. Still, I needed to bring the conversation back to the facts. So I said, Mr. Thompson, when you drive at 87 miles per hour, you're not just breaking a rule. You're putting people in danger. You, your passengers, and everyone else on that road. He interrupted me, his tone growing sharper. Oh, come on, Your Honor. I wasn't hurting anyone. There were no accidents. I was fine, I replied. You were fine, this time. Reckless driving doesn't need to cause an accident to be dangerous. It only takes one mistake, one distraction, for something irreversible to happen. He rolled his eyes slightly, and that's when I realized he wasn't hearing me. Not really. He was waiting for his turn to talk. It happens more often than you'd think. People come into court to speak, not to listen. So I stopped. I looked at him quietly for a few seconds. Silence can be powerful in the courtroom. It gives people a moment to confront their own words. Then I said, Mr. Thompson, you said you pay taxes. Do you think paying taxes gives you the right to ignore traffic laws? He shot back, I think paying taxes means I've already paid my dues. The city's got enough of my money. This is just another way to squeeze people. That's when I realized Marcus didn't see a courtroom. He saw an enemy. And yet I've always believed that when someone lashes out like that, it's not really about the fine. It's about something deeper. Frustration, hardship, or guilt. Sometimes it's a cry for help disguised as defiance. But in that moment, he wasn't ready for compassion. He was still trying to win an argument. So, I said, Mr. Thompson, I understand that times are difficult, but disrespecting the court or refusing to take responsibility will not help your situation. He muttered something under his breath, something about the system being rigged. I didn't react. Experience has taught me that anger often burns itself out faster when it's not fueled by confrontation. Instead, I decided to ground the discussion back in reality. I turned to the clerk and asked for his driving record to be displayed on the screen. I hadn't planned on doing that so soon, but I wanted him and everyone else in that courtroom to see that this wasn't about one ticket. It was about a pattern. As the record appeared, I could already see what I suspected: multiple violations, unpaid fines, and a growing disregard for accountability. Before I even spoke a word about it, Marcus shifted in his stance. He knew what was coming. I took a breath, looked back at him, and said, Mr. Thompson, you said you know how this works. Let's see if you really do. Because at that moment, I wasn't just trying to decide a fine. I was trying to reach a man who'd built a wall so high around his pride that not even common sense could get through. And I'll tell you this, that wall was about to crack. When I asked the clerk to pull up Marcus Thompson's driving record, I already had a feeling about what I was going to find. Over the years, I've learned that defiance rarely stands on its own. It usually has a history behind it, a string of bad choices, unpaid debts, and lessons that were ignored the first few times they came around. The screen lit up, and there it was in black and white. 4 speeding violations in the last 3 years. 2 citations for reckless driving, and 2 outstanding fines that were already in collections. It wasn't a record of someone who made a single mistake. It was the pattern of someone who simply refused to learn. I looked back at Marcus. Thompson, I said, according to this record, you've been cited multiple times for speeding and reckless driving, and you have 2 unpaid fines that total $800. Is that correct? He shifted on his feet. I don't keep track of every ticket I get. I nodded slowly. You don't keep track? That's part of the problem, isn't it? You don't keep track of what you owe or what these actions cost you. Not just in money, but in consequences. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of discomfort in his expression. Not guilt exactly, but the look of a man who didn't like being reminded of the truth. But it was gone just as quickly as it came. He shrugged again. It's all about money anyway. The city doesn't care about safety. They just want people's cash. And now I've heard that argument many times before. It's a convenient story. The idea that tickets exist just to fill city coffers. It's easier to believe that than to admit you were driving dangerously. But the truth is, traffic laws are written in the ink of tragedy. Every line, every limit, every rule comes from someone's mistake that cost a life. I said to him, Mr. Thompson, these fines aren't about taking money from you. They're about protecting people from reckless behavior, from accidents that don't give second chances. He looked unconvinced. Yeah, that's what they all say. So I took another approach. When logic fails, sometimes empathy reaches places reason can't. I scrolled further through the record and came across an additional note. Something from another set of public records linked to his name. I recognized it immediately. Divorce proceedings. I hesitated for a second. Family matters are personal, and I never bring them up lightly. But in this case, it was relevant. Because the report referenced his gambling addiction. I looked up from the screen. And Mr. Thompson, I said, I see from your court records that you went through a divorce about 2 years ago. Is that correct? His face tightened. What does that have to do with this? I'm trying to understand your financial situation and your pattern of behavior. I explained. And the records indicate that gambling addiction was cited as a factor in the divorce. Is that accurate? His jaw clenched. And that's personal business. I nodded. It is. But when your personal challenges start affecting your public responsibilities, when they put others at risk, they become the court's business too. He didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, the anger in his face hardening into silence. I continued gently but firmly. You have 2 children, ages 9 and 12. Do you pay child support? His answer came out quickly, almost defensive. When I can. When you can, I repeated. So your employment is inconsistent? Yeah, he said. I do construction work when I can find it. Not everyone's got a steady paycheck, you know. Times are tough. There was the frustration I'd been hearing all along now starting to take shape. He wasn't just angry at the ticket. He was angry at his circumstances, at the job market, at his ex-wife, at the system. And like so many people I've seen, he decided it was easier to blame the world than to face himself. I looked him in the eye and said quietly, Mr. Thompson, I don't doubt that times are hard. I understand struggle. But what I'm trying to make sense of is why a 42-year-old man with children who depend on him, with a record of unpaid fines and dangerous driving, believes the system is the problem, and not the choices he's making. He glared back. Because the system is the problem. Everyone's got their hand out. You people don't care if someone's trying to survive. You just want your money. It wasn't the first time I've been told that, and it probably won't be the last. But in that moment, I saw what was really happening. This wasn't about money at all. Marcus was at war with his own failures, and every time life asked him to take responsibility, he turned it into a fight. I leaned forward a bit. Mr. Thompson, let me ask you something honestly. You still have a gambling problem? He shot back immediately. That's none of your business. But I stayed calm. It becomes my business when your choices endanger others. When you can't pay your child support, when you owe $800 to the city, when you stand here and tell me you won't follow the law. That becomes the court's business." For the first time since he'd walked in, he didn't have a comeback. He looked down at the floor. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked less like an angry man and more like a tired one. Someone who'd been losing for so long, he didn't remember what winning responsibly even looked like. Then quietly he said, "You don't know anything about my life," I replied. "You're right, Mr. Thompson, I don't. But I know what it looks like when a good person gets trapped in bad habits. I've seen it too many times. And I know that the only way out is to stop blaming everyone else and start taking ownership." The courtroom was silent. You could feel the weight of the moment. Even the bailiff stood still, watching. And in that silence, I realized something important. Marcus didn't need a lecture. He needed a wake-up call. What he didn't yet know was that it was coming. Because the next few minutes in that courtroom would change everything. When I looked at Marcus standing there, shoulders tense, jaw locked, eyes darting between the floor and the ceiling, I knew we'd reached a crossroads. Moments like that come quietly, but they decide everything. I took a slow breath and said, "Mr. Thompson, I've listened to your explanation. I've reviewed your record. I've considered your circumstances. Now, it's time for me to make a ruling." He folded his arms again. Go ahead." His voice was cold, like he was daring me to do it. I continued it for the current violation. Reckless driving, 87 in a 55 zone. I'd be posing a fine of $300. Additionally, I'm ordering payment of your 2 outstanding fines totaling $800. That makes $1,100 due to the city of Providence. He laughed, not that comes from humor, but the bitter laugh of someone who feels beaten before the fight's over. Then he shook his head and said, "I told you, I'm not paying a damn cent." There was a ripple of reaction in the courtroom. A woman in the back row gasped softly. The bailiff's eyes moved to me, ready to intervene if needed. I raised my hand slightly to calm the room. "Thompson," I said evenly, "you have every right to disagree with my decision, but you do not have the right to disrespect the court." He leaned forward, his voice louder now. "A disrespect? You think this is respect? You sit up there acting like you care, but you don't. You probably never had to worry about bills or losing your job or your kids looking at you like you're a failure. You just read off your little script and tell people how bad they are." He was angry, yes, but more than that, he was exposed. His pain was showing through the cracks in his defiance. I stayed quiet for a moment, letting him finish. Then I said softly, "You done?" He hesitated, then muttered, "Yeah, I'm done." "Yeah, I'm done." I leaned forward slightly. "You're wrong about one thing, Mr. Thompson. I do understand struggle. I grew up in a household where my parents worked hard for everything we had. We didn't have much, but we had respect. For ourselves, for others, and for the law. That's what kept us going." He looked at me, but didn't say anything. You see," I continued, "the difference between you and me isn't where we started. It's what we chose to learn from the hard times. You've had your share of trouble. I see that. But instead of learning from it, you've turned your anger into armor. And that armor's kept you from growing." The courtroom was completely silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioner. He shook his head. "That's easy for you to say." "Maybe it is," I said. "But let me tell you something. Refusing to take responsibility doesn't make the burden lighter. It makes it heavier. Every unpaid fine, every broken promise, every person you've let down, it piles up. And one day it crushes you." He looked away, jaw tight again. Could have stopped there. I could have simply enforced the fine, ordered community service, and moved on to the next case. But something about this man, the way he lashed out like a wounded animal, that told me that this moment mattered. So I said, "Mr. Thompson, when was the last time you saw your kids?" That caught him off guard. His head snapped toward me. "What?" I said. I repeated gently, "When was the last time you saw your children?" He hesitated, then muttered, "A few months ago." "A few months ago?" He didn't answer at first. Then, almost in a whisper, "Their mother doesn't want them around me right now." "Because of your gambling?" I asked quietly. He nodded, barely perceptible. "Yeah, I'm working on it." I looked at him carefully. "And yet you're standing here in front of your children's city, saying you won't take responsibility for your actions. Do you think that's the example they need?" That question hung in the air like a bell that refused to stop ringing. For the first time, Marcus didn't have an answer. His anger started to fade into something else, something quieter. Shame, maybe. Realization, said Mr. Thompson. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to remind you that every decision has a ripple effect. Your children are watching even when you think they're not. When they grow up, do you want them to remember their father as the man who blamed the world? Or as the man who finally stood up and made things right? His eyes dropped to the floor. His shoulders sank. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, in a voice much softer than before, he said, I don't know if I can fix all of it. I replied, you don't have to fix everything at once, but you can start somewhere. Paying these fines isn't just about the money. It's about taking that first step, showing your kids that you can be accountable. I could see the fight leaving him. He took a deep breath and nodded slightly. If I pay, can I get a payment plan or something? I smiled just a little. That's the first reasonable thing you've said all morning. There was a faint chuckle in the room. Even Marcus cracked a tired smile. I told him, yes, Mr. Thompson, you could set up a payment plan. But here's my condition. You complete 20 hours of community service in addition to the payments. So I want you to contribute to this city in a way that doesn't involve money, something that helps others. He nodded again, this time more sincerely. Yeah. All right. Good, I said. Then we have an understanding. As I brought down the gavel, I looked at him one last time. You walked into this courtroom ready for a fight, I told him. But sometimes the real victory is learning when to stop fighting everyone else and start fighting for yourself. He didn't say He didn't say a word. But when he turned to leave, his head wasn't as low as when he came in. And I knew for the first time that morning that maybe, just maybe, Marcus Thompson had finally heard me. When the gavel came down that morning, the courtroom fell silent. I presided over thousands of cases, but some linger long after the day is done, and Marcus Thompson was one of them. As he walked out, I watched him stop at the clerk's desk. He wasn't storming out this time. He was listening, nodding, asking questions about setting up his payment plan. It may not sound like much, but in a courtroom like mine, that's where real change begins, with a single quiet decision to do better. I remember thinking maybe this man finally understands that the law isn't his enemy. It's his last opportunity to take back control. That's something people often misunderstand about justice. They think it's about punishment, about the fine, the penalty, the suspension. But it's not. It's about the chance to stop the spiral. When someone like Marcus stands before me, I see more than the violations on paper. I see the years of pain that build up behind every bad decision. I see a man drowning, but still pretending he can swim. And I've learned that if you don't reach out in that moment, if you just hand down the sentence and move on, you miss the chance to turn punishment into purpose. I don't know what Marcus did in the days that followed. Judges rarely do. Once a defendant walks out, their choices are their own. But I hope he kept that promise to himself, the one he didn't say out loud, but that I saw in his eyes right before he left. The look that said, I'm tired of losing everything. I've met many men like Marcus. Different names, same pain. They come in angry, ready to fight everyone, convinced the system is out to get them. But what they're really fighting is themselves. And sometimes, the only way to break that pattern is through a little accountability wrapped in compassion. That balance, firmness, and empathy. My courtroom on. Because if all I did was hand out fines, I'd be no better than the machine they think I represent. But if I can help someone see the reason behind the consequence, that's justice. You see, a fine doesn't just pay for a traffic violation. It reminds you that your actions have weight. Every decision, from pressing the gas pedal a little harder to walking into a courtroom full of defiance, adds up to the life you build or destroy. Marcus's story isn't just about speeding. It's about how denial can turn a small mistake into a collapse. How pride can be more expensive than any ticket. That's why I spoke to him about his children. Because underneath the anger, there was still a father in that man. One who wanted to be seen as more than his mistakes. And that's the heart of it. When I look at people like Marcus, I don't see criminals. I see human beings who've forgotten how much they matter to themselves and to the people waiting for them to come home. Sometimes justice looks like mercy. Sometimes it looks like a hard truth you've been avoiding for years. And sometimes It looks like a man walking out of my courtroom not with a clean record, but with a clean start. As I gathered my papers that morning, I looked around the courtroom at the faces of the people waiting for their turn. Some were nervous, some impatient, some defiant. Maybe, just maybe, after watching Marcus's case, one of them understood what I was trying to teach. That responsibility isn't a punishment. It's freedom. The moment you accept it, you stop being at war with the world and you start rebuilding your place in it. That's what I hope Marcus Thompson learned that day. Because in my courtroom, justice isn't just about the law. It's about giving people one last chance to listen, not to me, but to their better selves.